himself. After all, a pastor cannot be very effective if his own life is a mess. He takes heed to himself. Even those members within the church, he called them members within the church who will raise up and try to split the church and destroy the church. We saw that his primary goal is to teach, to guard, and to protect the sheep. We saw in Acts when they ordained the deacons that Peter said, "We will give ourselves unto prayer and the ministry of the word." In other words, he's to preach and teach whatever necessary to guard the sheep and to spread the word throughout Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, to the uttermost parts of the world. I'm not going to get into all the various ways that we can reach the world in our modern day and time, but I don't think any of us have come quite as far as the Apostle Paul did. Now, in tonight's lesson, we know and we understand Jesus is the chief shepherd, as Peter showed us the other night. Christ is and must be the chief shepherd. But as pastors, we are under shepherds. And as under shepherds, we're to follow the example of the great shepherd himself. Now, I want to start, like I said, I'm going to start in the beginning of chapter 10. And we're going to go through, hopefully, in the next hour and a half, we're going to go through much of chapter 10. And then I will look at a few other verses. I thought about calling the title as The Heart of a Pastor, the role of a pastor, the pastor as a shepherd. Notice in verse 3, and I hope you still have your Bibles open. In verse 3, verse 3, to him the porter openeth, and the sheep hear his voice, and he calleth his own sheep by name, and leadeth them out. Many of you already know that I am not a big fan of what are called mega churches. I've heard all kinds of things with that, but notice a good shepherd, the good shepherd, and a good under shepherd calls his own sheep by name. Now, God knows every star. He's named every star. He counts the grains of sand. Obviously, he knows more than you and I will ever know. But a pastor must know his sheep by name. I was talking to someone this past week, and they go to one of the mega churches here in town. And I said, what happens if you get sick and call the pastor? Hey, I'm in the hospital. I said, I'll tell you what's going to happen. He's going to say, who are you? I don't know you. I don't know your name. Oh, well, you're number 4,618. Oh, that's right. You're not a name, you're a number. And he said, the good shepherd knows his sheep by name, and he calls them by name, and he knows his sheep, not only their name, which we'll see, but also he knows them. He goes before them. He leadeth them. It's the job of the shepherd to lead the sheep. And I'll get to this in the next phase on the church's role or responsibility to the pastor. But he goes before them, and the sheep follow him. In verse 4, they follow him. He goes before, looking for danger, looking for water and grass so that the sheep can be fed. He goes ahead so that if there is danger ahead, he sees it, knows it, before the sheep are ever aware that there is danger. Now, growing up around military, you know who the most vulnerable guy in the military is? How many of you think you know? One. He's the point guy, isn't he? He's the guy that goes out in front of the platoon and looks, and if their enemy is going to attack, he's going to usually get the point man first because he's first in line. The pastor goes ahead looking for the danger and looking for grass and for feed. Notice in verse 5, the sheep follow the shepherd. They will not follow a stranger. It bothers me tremendously when members sometimes are willing to follow anybody and everybody except their own pastor. Their pastor can say something that's like, I don't have to listen to that. Somebody on the radio, somebody on the TV, or somebody else can say the same thing and they'll follow him. But they won't follow their own pastor. And I'm presenting this from my perspective. They will listen to anybody on radio or TV and think, oh, I wish my pastor was like that. You know, it's kind of like marriage, and I'll get to this. You know the success, do you know the reason for a good, successful marriage? Compromise. I don't get my way all the time, but occasionally my wife will let me have my way. The third one is commitment. We got married June the 10th, 1972, and we made a commitment. No matter how bad things get, divorce is off the table. It wasn't even an option. And there were a few times I said, did you ever think about divorce? Never thought about divorce, but we both thought about murder-suicide a few times. But divorce was off the table. My commitment was to her. Her commitment was unto me, and we survived for 50 years because when we have disagreed, and she'll get on me for saying this, she always accepted the fact that I was the head of the home. We would talk, we would discuss, we would pray about things, but when the final decision came down, she was willing to follow me as her leader. And in a church, some people think their pastor is the dumbest person on earth, and I've met a few preachers who qualified. But not every pastor is going to know everything about everybody. So just as my wife and I committed to marriage, in 50 years, divorce was never an option. It was never on the table. But didn't you ever have problems? Yeah, occasionally she would backslide and, we would have to work it out. But you know what? We worked it out. We talked it out. We prayed it out. You know the secret to a good success? When you've got a shepherd who hopefully will fill the role this evening, and you've got people who are committed first and foremost to God. Secondly, they're committed to the church that God placed them in. And thirdly, they're committed. I don't mean a mental institution. In my years, I've seen people that just rebelled for sheer stubbornness. They're not going to follow the pastor. I don't care what he says or what he does. They wouldn't follow their pastor out an exit door if the house was on fire. They're not going to follow. They're not going to do anything that he asked them to do. And in my experience, many of those times, it's out of sheer rebellion, sheer stubbornness. I don't like him. I'm not going to follow him. Some just don't have a reason. They're just not going to take orders from anybody. Period. That's another good reason why I am so thankful that God has allowed us to be here for over 30 years. There's a reason for that. And when I was looking at this last week, some people treat a church like they do marriage. I'll marry this one this year. If I don't like her, I'll marry someone else next year. If I don't like them, I'll marry someone else next year. There's no commitment. We recently had Brother Scott Giley, been at Newbie for 50 years. And I can almost see some people go, oh no, we got 20 more to go. He's committed to Newbie, and I've been there many times. I preached there numerous times, and they are just as committed to him as he is to them. Can't think of the other preacher I recently invited to preach. Been at his church over 40 years. Then you actually build a relationship. And again, I keep going back to marriage. You marry and divorce, you marry and divorce. You never have time to build a lasting relationship. I look very much at, as a pastor in a church, I look at a relationship very similar to marriage. You're going to disagree. Do you think my wife agrees with me 100%? Every minute, every hour, every day, every week, every month, every year, for over 50 years? You think she has never disagreed with me? Boy, you need to talk to her after church. Some people, and I'm going to chase this rabbit. I had a young lady years ago at a company with the print shop that we do. We still do thousands and thousands of dollars of business with them. There was this young lady, she was the receptionist, and when I would go up, usually they delivered things, but if I had to go up, she was the one I usually met first. And I asked her back when I first began to meet her, are you married? I ask that to a lot of young girls that are I think, or might be single. Are you married? She said, no, but we're living together. And what would you say in that situation? I said, young lady, you're crazy. I said, he's getting all of the benefits of marriage without any commitment whatsoever. Oh, he loves me. He will never leave. I was back a few months later and I said, I'm telling you, he's getting everything for free with no commitment. She said, he left me the other day. There's no commitment because there was no marriage. Marriage is commitment. He took her for free, everything he could get, until he found someone else better, and he dumped her like a hot potato. And I told her, I said, I tried to warn you. That's why God made marriage first, because then you're committed. Well, verse 11, a good shepherd or a good pastor is willing to die for his sheep. I don't know of any pastor who would be so stupid or do something so stupid that he would get himself killed trying to be a martyr. Now, there may be some, they're not in my circles. I think, and I've never been put to the test, but I really believe if someone had messed with my wife, my children, or any of my children's families, I would do everything in my power, even if it meant being killed, to defend my wife, our children, and their families. I used to tell people, when all three of our kids were still at home, what would you do if you walked in and found somebody molesting your daughter? I said, easy, that's an easy one. I hope they're saved because they're fixing to meet their master. I'm not looking for a fight, don't want to fight, but I would fight till death to defend my wife, my kids, and their families. And a pastor who is not willing to suffer and die if necessary for his church that God has given him, God has placed him, if he's not willing to sacrifice to the point of death, he needs to find another line of work. I'm not trying to be rude. He is not fit to pastor. I would like to think that if Satan tried to stir up, cause division, tried to teach false doctrine, tried to split the church, I would stand like the Rock of Gibraltar. Because a good shepherd has one primary goal, and that's the sheep. Sometimes it means sacrificing time. Sometimes it means sacrificing money. And unfortunately, I know some preachers who have compromised and everything else because they have a good salary and they don't want to lose it. Shame on them. They're nothing more than a hireling. Sometimes it means a lot of energy. But a good shepherd, a good pastor, will stand no matter the cost to fight for and to defend the church that the Holy Spirit made him overseer. That's why I have tried in my almost 50 years pastoring, I have tried never to run away from a wolf or a battle if it means compromising the church. And boy, I've had some battles over those 50 years. We pastored in Indiana. I had one family that, well, let's just say the church eventually had to exclude them for sowing discord and causing division. We moved to Ohio, and I had that deacon I've referred to who, if I said the Lord's coming back, he would vote against it. He was just that arrogant and that antagonistic. If I said we need to turn the lights on, he would vote to turn them out just for pure spite. We moved to Texas. And again, I had one family that was probably the wealthiest family in Brazoria County, one of the most powerful counties or families in the county. He's the one that went into my study one day and said, "It's time you left." I've never ran. Never ran. Sometimes, unfortunately, you have to go to battle to protect the church. When David said, "I killed the lion and I killed the bear to protect the flock," he put his life at risk. I've never fought a bear or a lion, but I have fought some deacons and people that you think. My wife and I have gone home, and she said, "Do you think I should start packing before they fire you?" I said, "If they fire me, they're going to fire me. I'm not going to quit in the heat of battle. I'm not going to do that." Unfortunately, I did leave one church. The guy that said, "I think it's time for you to leave," got his wishes. We left. But I went down fighting right down to the last breath. A preacher who won't fight for his church doesn't love the church like a good shepherd. Do you remember Korah in the Old Testament? How that Korah got a very large following, and they literally withstood Moses. You remember what happened to Korah and all of his group? Remember what happened to them? You do. 3, 4 do. 5, 6. Okay. God opened up the earth, and they fell straight down into the earth. And God closed the earth back over them. Korah and his entire following. You know what happened the next day, the very next day? Do you know what happened? The very next day. How many of you know what happened? The very next day, too. The very next day, they attacked Moses for getting rid of the bad guys. Have you ever heard of anything? I mean, these people, God opened up the earth, and they literally fell right into hell, and God closed the earth back up. And the people got mad at Moses for killing the bad guys. Well, that never happens in Baptist churches. I wished I had $1 for every time it's happened. Well, I must move on. Verses 12 and 13. He gives the difference between the good shepherd and the hireling. The good shepherd is willing to die for the sheep. A hireling will flee at the first sign of trouble. And I'm going to inject here, because he is a hireling, he will run the first time another church offers him more money or more benefits. He's only in it for the money. He's only in it for what he can get out of it. It may be money. And you were here when I came. They called and said the church has voted to call you. After a week or two, I called and said, I believe God is in it. I accept. He never once asked, how much do you pay? To me, it didn't matter if you paid $50 a week or $50,000 a week. I have never gone to a church for money, nor have I ever declined a church for money. I know one preacher who left a great church because he was asked to pastor a much bigger church, much more money, much more prestigious. Some people are in it for pride, but trust me, those people will not stick it out when trouble comes. He will run at the first sign of attack because he doesn't love the sheep. Look in verse 13. He careth not for the sheep. He has no interest in the sheep. He doesn't care what happens to the sheep. He's only interested in what happens to him. Very quickly, four other passages. In 2 Corinthians chapter 4, Paul is giving us an inside view of what it was like to be a pastor / missionary. 2 Corinthians 2:14, for out of much affliction and anguish of heart, I wrote unto you with many tears. Now you remember 1 Corinthians, they had multiple problems in the church. They had open sin in the church. They had major divisions within the church. In 1 Corinthians, Paul wrote a very strongly worded letter to deal with the sins within the church. But in 2 Corinthians, he didn't just sit down and write a letter because he was mad. He didn't just sit down and write a letter so he could tell them people off. He said, before I wrote that letter, I had much affliction and much anguish of heart. I wrote unto you with many tears. Many tears. Why? That ye should not be grieved, but that you might know the love which I have more abundantly unto you. You know why a pastor will stand and fight for truth and right? I can't even begin to tell you how much anguish, how many tears he sheds before he ever gets up to preach a message that he knows is going to be a reprove and rebuke message. Out of much affliction, anguish of heart, I wrote with many tears. Paul didn't do it to be fun. He didn't do it to show who's boss. He did it because he loved the church and demonstrated his love by taking a firm stand against sin. 2 Corinthians chapter 7. For when we were come into Macedonia, our flesh had no rest, but we were troubled on every side. Without were fightings, within were fears. Paul had sent young Timothy to check on the church and see how the church had received 1 Corinthians. He said, when I went to Macedonia, my flesh had no rest. Most people have no idea How many times a broken-hearted pastor goes to bed and cannot sleep because of things that are going on within the church. Without were fightings. Within were fears. What are you afraid of, Paul? I love the church at Corinth so much. I'm afraid they won't accept reproof and rebuke. And I'm afraid they may continue on in sin. Most people never know the heartbreaks, the troubled nights, the lost sheep, the fightings within, without, and the fears within. Because Satan is attacking the church. And right or wrong, he feels the full load of that attack on his shoulders. If he doesn't love the church, that when discipline becomes necessary, if it doesn't break his heart, something's wrong. 2 Corinthians chapter 11, verse 28. Paul wrote, beside those things that are without, that which cometh upon me daily, daily, the care of all the churches. There are times where, there have been times where all day and all night, all you could think about, all you could pray about was the care of the church. One last verse, Hebrews 13:17, and I used this verse last week under the role of a pastor, but I want to read the rest of it. Obey them that have the rule over you and submit yourselves, for they watch for your souls. The reason you submit, if they're a good shepherd, like the chief shepherd, they're watching for your souls. They're watching for danger. They're watching for things that can trip you up. And he said, it's not just every once in a while, it's daily. He's watching for your soul. Because ultimately, he must give account for every one of those sheep. I contact some of our disciplined members occasionally. You know why? Because I watch for their souls, even though they're disciplined. I understand that I'm going to stand before God and I'm going to give an account of every single sheep God placed into the flock that he gave me. He must give an account. I think I've been here 30 years. Most of you know I'm a long way from being perfect. But I'll guarantee you one thing. My heart's desire, my prayer, my goal to do anything, fight, die, whatever, to protect each and every one of you that God has added to this church. And a good shepherd will do that. If he's in it for the money, first time somebody gives him grief, he's gone. He's not there for the duration. He's not there for the eternal side of it. He's only there as long as things go nice. I was kidding someone, I know who it was. It was the lady that came down Friday with the group from the school. And we were talking about marriage, and her oldest daughter is married. And she said they went back and looked at the video of the wedding. And she said that as soon as I now pronounce you husband and wife, the new husband was dragging his wife down the aisle to get out. And I laughed and I said, my wife and I had our very first disagreement walking down the aisle. She wanted to walk slow, and take it easy, and I want to get out of there. And sometimes it's easy to take the easy way out. But a man that runs in the midst of heat is a hireling. I've given you the role, 2 parts, of what you can expect and should expect of a pastor. Next week, Lord willing, we will turn it around. What are the duties of a church to the pastor? And I'm going to be nicer than I've been looking at my part of it.